So I'm standing in Sydney Park. For those that don't know the park, it sits on the borderlands between St Peters, Erskineville, Newtown and Alexandria. And the reason I'm standing here is because of this structure behind me, which many of you might have driven past previously when you're going in part of Sydney. And so what this is a brick making kiln. And there used to be a booming brick industry across the inner west in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And indeed, this entire park of Sydney Park was full of holes in the ground where they were excavating to make bricks. But it was not just here, it was all across different parts of the inner west. And this brick making industry in the inner west is an important backstory to fully understanding why Erskineville and Newtown became known as Typhoid Valley. And so I'm going to provide kind of a context of the background of the political economy of the brick making industry and how it links to water within this area. So kind of a broad history of brick making in Sydney. As a fledgling colony early on, there was one convict with brick making skills and they used him to set up convict labour to make bricks in what turned out to be just on the outskirts of the colony in a place they called Brickfields. And Brickfields is now in modern day Paddy's markets, but it was kind of a separate village at the time. This village was just on the outskirts and it was called Brickfields. However, in 1841, the colonial government decided to want to clean up this brickfields. So they shut down the brickmaking industry by convicts on the outskirts of Sydney. And then brickmakers had to move out from there. And it moved from convict labour to actually small businesses, usually sometimes family-run businesses, sometimes groups of friends, setting up brickmaking excavation sites further outside of Sydney. And initially this was in areas of Surrey Hills and Camperdown, but actually the most popular site early on in the 1850s and 1860s was actually in Newtown and Erskineville. And the operations were pretty rudimentary. It was usually a lean-to shack, a kind of a portable little disposable kiln they'd use on one site. They'd dig a hole, get the clay out of the soil, make bricks, and then move to another site and dig a new hole. And so that was kind of how the industry was dominated from the 50s and 60s and gradually moving out. But once again, early on, it was quite small operations. We then see changing dynamics in the 1880s and 1890s that really changed the dynamics of the brick industry. And what we see in this period is kind of post-gold rush in New South Wales, the booming population of Sydney, where Sydney goes from a very small 50,000 person settlement to over 250,000. We also see changes in technology with brick making with new kind of steam technologies to kind of create bricks and do it on a larger scale. And so with these changes, there's kind of distinct geographical location changes to the brickmaking industry. For one, the urban spread of Sydney finally reaches Newtown and Erskineville, which had initially been farming areas and then brickmaking areas, and they are now becoming urban areas. So there's kind of a challenge of covering up brick pits there and establishing residents on top. And a lot of the iconic terrace houses that you see across inner west in Newtown and Erskineville were built in the late 1880s. And so also what we see from the 1880s onwards is this gradual shift from small family operations to large-scale mass production of bricks. And so gradually we see the displacement of these small operations to these big companies that are making brick kilns like this. And indeed, Sydney Park's kind of a classic space for this. Early maps shows it divided into maybe 50, 60 different operations. But by the early 1900s, it was owned by one big operation. Initially Bedford Bricks, which was brought out by Austral Bricks. And indeed, they owned many sites. And if you look across Marrickville, Dulwich Hill, Ashbury, all these towns, you can see these old big sites. And many of them have been converted into parks like we have here today. A critical thing with this kind of boom in the brick industry is that a lot of brickmakers got very wealthy and very rich and very influential. And that kind of affected how the brick industry was regulated and what kind of dynamics went on. For one, even though there was a boom in bricks, it was not shared and often the workers had quite poor conditions. And indeed, child labour was quite problematic within a lot of the brickmaking sites. And there was a kind of a rise of an early union movement among bricklayers and brickmakers to kind of fight against this. But what the brickmakers did is they used their association bodies, the Master Builders Association, to fight to have any responsibility for the pits they made in the ground. So they argued they could kind of go in, extract all the clay, make big holes in the ground, and then leave and move to the next pit. And it was the responsibility of local governments to clean it up. And to extend their influence, we see a lot of these early brickmaker companies and brickmakers, barons, getting involved in other areas of profit. One was real estate speculation, so getting involved in actually building houses and renting them in the inner west across Erskineville and Newtown. They also often got involved in politics. So a lot of early mayors, aldermen and councils around this area were brickmakers. And actually a real classic example of this is one Henry Knight, who was the first mayor of Erskineville. He actually moved to this area in the mid-1800s, started up brick operations, got wealthy making bricks. He then moved into speculative real estate and built a whole lot of houses across Erskineville and Newtown and sold those and became a landlord or rented those out. He also became the first mayor of Erskineville. So what we really see is these close links between kind of economic capital and wealthy brick makers, the politicians in terms of mayors, and this kind of emerging real estate market of kind of landlordism happening in this area. And it's the intersections of these which we will see kind of help create the kind of structural issues that cause this area to become what was described by the Sydney Morning Herald as a typhoid valley.